A spooky old house, some strange new servants, and horrifying supernatural events all add up to a terrifying encounter for Nicole Kidman in this thrilling horror movie from 2001. I think most of us are scared of ghosts, but can you be sure if you're being haunted from the past or by events yet to occur? Let's take a trip to the year 1945 and find out. Grace wakes from a nightmare and looks around in horror. She lives in a huge country house, and one day, 3 strangers come knocking at her door. She realizes that they must be the new serving staff. They introduce themselves as the housekeeper, Bertha Mills, the gardener, Edmund Tuttle, and a mute girl named Lydia. Grace shows them to their quarters and explains how the previous servants just disappeared almost a week ago. Mrs. Mills remarks how odd this sounds, but Grace explains that there are times when this house is not an ideal home, hence why the advert asks for honest and hard-working people. Mrs. Mills and Mr. Tuttle both reassure her that they are both honest and very hard-working. Grace tells them that she has not heard from her husband since he left for the war. She goes on to explain that the rules of the house are that one door may not be opened before the previous door is locked shut. Mrs. Mills is given the keys to the doors. She instructs them not to allow too much noise in the house and informs them that they have no electricity. Mrs. Mills and Lydia are taken to meet the children. Grace lights some lamps and tells them to not open the curtains. Anne and Nicholas emerge from the dark, and Grace explains that her children are allergic to the light and will suffocate if exposed to bright light. At breakfast, Anne asks Mrs. Mills if she will leave like the others did. Mrs. Mills says no, but Anne tells her that that is what the others said before it happened. Nicholas tries to shush her, and the children argue. Their mother appears and asks to speak with Mrs. Mills in private. Outside, Grace has discovered that the postman never came last week, and so the letter that she sent to advertise the vacancies never reached the newspaper. She demands to know how the new servants knew about the jobs. Mrs. Mills explains that they just came by on the off chance that there were vacancies, and that they did in fact work here for many years before. Grace agrees that they may all stay. Sometime later, the children are studying. Grace decides to separate the children, but Nicholas is scared in case he sees a ghost. She tells him that whenever he is scared, he should squeeze his rosary and say a prayer. As his mother leaves, Nicholas looks nervously over his shoulder. Whilst talking with Mrs. Mills, Grace discovers that Lydia was not born a mute. She suddenly hears her son crying and rushes to join him. Nicholas is fine, so she runs to check on Anne, who is also fine. Anne tells Grace that the crying came from a boy named Victor. She explains that Victor was crying because he doesn't like this house but has to live here. Grace scolds her for lying, demanding to know how Victor could get out of the room if the doors are locked, before noticing that the other door is indeed unlocked. Grace admonishes the staff for leaving the door unlocked, but nobody will own up to it. At dinner, Nicholas asks Anne about Victor and if he is a ghost. That night, Anne wakes Nicholas to show him that Victor has opened the curtains. She tells Victor to show himself to Nicholas, but Nicholas is too scared to look. As Anne gets up to close the curtains, she tells Nicholas that Victor keeps opening them before she engages in an argument with Victor. Nicholas is petrified and tells Anne that he will tell their mother. A hand touches his face and he screams. Grace races into the room and yells at her daughter for teasing her brother. The following day, Anne is made to read from the Bible as punishment, but will not ask for forgiveness, as she maintains that there was someone else in the room with them. Some days later, Grace is working and asks Mrs. Mills to instruct Lydia to keep the noise down when she is working. Mrs. Mills leaves to tell her, but the noise upstairs gets worse. Grace calls out for Lydia, but suddenly notices that she is outside speaking with Mrs. Mills. Grace goes to investigate, passing Anne on the stairs. She continues to hear strange noises, and Anne points her towards a room. Grace opens the door, and inside there are many objects covered in sheets. She looks around and hears some whispers. Startled by a loud noise, she starts to pull off the sheets before she sees the reflection of the door closing behind her. Grace runs out of the room and Anne points her to where the figures fled. Anne tells her mother that they said that they are going to take down the curtains as well. Afterwards, Mrs. Mills is trying to reassure Grace that everything is okay, but Nicholas then produces a drawing he has made of the strangers. I don't know about you, but kids' drawings in movies tend to really creep me out. Grace initiates a search of the house while Anne tells her that Victor said that the old woman is a witch. The curtains are all open during the search, and Grace discovers a Book of the Dead containing photographs of corpses. Mrs. Mills arrives and explains that the people used to keep these pictures as a way of remembering their loved ones. Mrs. Mills later tells her that when she worked there previously, there was an outbreak of tuberculosis in the area, which is when Lydia stopped talking. After Mrs. Mills goes to bed, Grace checks on her children, and Nicholas asks when is his father coming home. She then hears the piano playing, and armed with a gun, she enters the music room, but it is empty. She locks the piano, and as she leaves the room, the door slams shut, knocking her to the ground. She calls for Mrs. Mills, who uses her keys to let her back in the room, where they notice that the piano is again unlocked. Grace convinces herself that the house is haunted and is surprised to find that Mrs. Mills believes her. Grace rushes away to fetch a priest to bless the house. On her way, she instructs Mr. Tuttle to search for a graveyard on the land and look to see if he can find a gravestone for the little boy named Victor. As she leaves, Mr. Tuttle asks Mrs. Mills if she thinks it is wise to let her go, but Mrs. Mills assures him that the fog won't let her get far. Mr. Tuttle then continues his job of covering gravestones with fallen leaves. Meanwhile, Grace is walking through the grounds, but becomes disorientated in the fog. Suddenly, she runs into her husband, Charles, who she believed was killed during the war. They return to the house, and Grace introduces her husband. Mrs. Mills eyes him suspiciously before going to see his children. Grace argues with her daughter at lunch because Grace now denies that there are intruders in the house. Anne runs away, and Mrs. Mills comforts her by confirming that she has also seen the intruders. Mrs. Mills soon joins the other servants, and they conspire together. Grace is now made up with her daughter, and they play together in the spare room. Anne is dressed in her communion gown. Grace leaves her to join her husband, but he is unresponsive, and so she returns to her daughter. However, when she opens the door, she sees Anne playing on the floor, but realizes that something is wrong. As she approaches, she sees that an old woman is wearing the dress, and so she starts to attack her. Suddenly, she realizes that it is in fact her daughter that she was attacking. Mrs. Mills bursts through the door and takes the terrified child away. Later, Grace tries to justify her actions to Mrs. Mills, who tells her to leave the operation of the house to them, as they know what needs to be done. This angers Grace, and she asks to be left alone. She goes to the bedroom, and Charles wants to talk about what happened that day. Meanwhile, Anne tells her brother that their mother has gone mad in the same way that she did that day. Charles reveals that he only came to say goodbye and must return to the front, even though Grace tells him that the war is over. They climb into bed together and embrace one another. Grace wakes the following morning to find that Charles has gone. The children wake and scream because all the curtains are gone. Grace covers her children with her coat and hides them in a darkened room. She then accuses the servants of taking down the curtains and orders them to all leave the house at gunpoint. As they leave, the servants determine to go and uncover the gravestones. As night falls, the children decide to go outside to find their father. Meanwhile, Grace discovers a photograph dating from 1891, which shows the dead bodies of Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and Lydia. Outside, Anne discovers their actual gravestones. Nicholas looks around and sees the servants advancing on them. Anne tells him to run, and they escape back to the house. They are met by their mother, who orders them inside before shooting at the servants. Mrs. Mills tells her that the bullets are ineffective as they died of tuberculosis many years ago. And now it's getting good. Mrs. Mills explains that she is only trying to explain the new situation, how the living and the dead must all learn to live together. How do the dead live? I'm still scratching my head over that one. Mr. Tuttle says that the others took the curtains down and now they are in the house with her and the children. Mrs. Mills affirms that sooner or later they will find them. Upstairs, the children are hiding and are confronted by the old woman. Mrs. Mills tells Grace that she should go upstairs and talk to them. Grace discovers that the old woman is a psychic who is conducting a seance with Victor's parents. The psychic determines that Grace killed her children with a pillow, and she asks why they are still here if they are dead. The children cry out that they are not dead, and Grace runs across, banging the table and throwing some papers. The psychic leaves the trance, and Victor's mother is scared. It seems that Grace also made a terrible decision after finishing her children. She demands that their family leave the house for the sake of their son. Grace is hugging her children and finally realizes the truth, that the others are in fact a family that have moved into the house, and she and her children and the servants are actually ghosts. Talk about having a bad day. Mrs. Mills goes to make a cup of tea, and as the family hug each other, Grace chants with her children that the house is theirs. The children go to play in the sunlight and find that it doesn't hurt anymore. Outside, Victor and his family leave the house and the gate is locked behind them. On the gate, a for sale sign is present. What do you think about this movie? And have you ever experienced a ghost? Let us know in the comments below.